The neon red light of the broken spoke sign hummed with an electric buzz that seemed to harmonize with the cicadas screaming in the Texas heat. It was a sound that usually brought comfort to anyone who called Austin home, a signal that cold beer and the shuffle of boots on a sawdust floor were just a few steps away. The parking lot was filled with the kind of trucks that had dents in the tailgates and mud on the tires, vehicles that worked for a living, just like the men and women inside them. The air smelled of asphalt, barbecue smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of stale beer wafting from the open door whenever a patron stumbled out into the humid night. It was a place of legends, a honky-tonk cathedral where the walls were plastered with photos of the greats who had passed through, their signatures fading under layers of nicotine stains and time. But tonight, the man sitting in the black King Ranch Ford F-350 in the far corner of the lot wasn't thinking about the music inside. He wasn't thinking about the applause or the way the crowd would roar if he walked through those double doors. George Strait sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The engine was off, but the silence inside the cab was deafening. He stared at the broken spokes entrance, watching a young couple laugh as they walked in hand, without a care in the world. He envied them. At 69 years old, the man the world knew as the king of country felt a weight on his chest that no amount of platinum records could lift. He had just come from a meeting in a private back room of a lawyer's office 3 blocks away, a meeting that had confirmed his worst fears, not for himself, but for the man who had been his right hand for 3 decades. The air conditioning in the truck clicked as the metal cooled, a sharp sound in the quiet cab. George reached up and adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower as if to hide from the moon itself. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes staring back were familiar to millions, blue and piercing, usually crinkled with a smile. Tonight they were tired. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and couldn't fix everything, no matter how hard he tried. He turned the key in the ignition. The diesel engine roared to life, a deep guttural growl that vibrated through the seat. He didn't want a drink. He didn't want a song. He wanted home. He wanted the silence of the ranch and the voice of the only person who truly knew the man behind the starched shirt and the cowboy hat. As he pulled out of the lot, leaving the glow of the broken spoke behind in the dust, George Strait began the long drive south toward the ranch, unaware that the sanctuary he was seeking was about to become the most public stage of his entire life. Miles away in the heart of the hill country, the Strait family ranch lay under a blanket of stars so thick it looked like spilled milk across the obsidian sky. The main house was a sprawling structure of limestone and timber, built to withstand the Texas storms and house generations of memories. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon and roasted chicken. It was a lived-in room, the heart of the home, with a massive oak table that had scratches from spurs and rings from coffee mugs accumulated over 40 years of marriage. This was not a celebrity's show kitchen. It was a rancher's workspace. Copper pots hung from a rack above the island, and a ceramic sugar bowl painted with bluebonnets sat prominently on the table. Norma Strait stood by the counter, frowning at a smartphone that seemed to be mocking her. She adjusted her glasses, peering over the rim at the screen, her finger hovering uncertainly over the glowing icons. She was a woman of immense grace and strength, the anchor that had held George steady through the tidal waves of fame. But technology was a frontier she navigated with reluctance. She wanted to record a video message for their granddaughter, who was away at college and feeling homesick. Norma wanted to show her how to make the special dumpling soup that had cured every cold in the family since the 80s. She propped the phone up against the bluebonnet sugar bowl. It slipped. She sighed, a soft sound of frustration, and grabbed a heavy pepper grinder to brace the other side. The angle was low, slightly crooked, capturing the expanse of the wooden table, the refrigerator covered in family photos in the background, and the back door that led to the mudroom. It was an intimate, unguarded frame. Norma wiped her hands on her floral apron and leaned in close to the lens, her face filling the screen. "Okay, let's see here," she muttered to herself, her voice echoing slightly in the large kitchen. Bubba said it was the red button. "Just press the red button." She tapped the screen. She expected a countdown or a flashing rec symbol. Instead, the screen flickered, and a small icon in the corner turned bright red with the words "Live" pulsing steadily. Norma didn't notice the word. She didn't notice that she hadn't opened the camera app, but rather the social media platform George's management team had installed on her phone to help her stay connected with the fan base, an app she rarely touched. She didn't realize that the account logged in was not a private family circle, but the official page linked to the George Strait brand, a page followed by millions of people who had notifications turned on for any activity. Norma straightened up, smoothing her apron, completely oblivious to the digital floodgates she had just opened. "All right, sweetheart, I hope this is working," she said to the empty room, turning her back to the camera to stir a pot on the stove. The camera remained focused on the table and the door. In the bottom left corner of the screen, the number 0 flickered and changed to 50, then 500, then 5,000. Across the world, phones buzzed in pockets, tablets lit up on nightstands. In Nashville, a songwriter stopped strumming his guitar to check the notification. In a truck stop in Oklahoma, a waitress wiped her hands and tapped the screen. In a high-rise in Tokyo, a banker paused his meeting. The notification was simple: George Strait is live. The comments began to trickle in, confusing at first. "Is this a mistake? I'm seeing a kitchen. Is that Norma? Oh my God, are we in his house? Someone tell her she doesn't know." The view count skyrocketed to 50,000 in under 2 minutes. The image was grainy, the lighting warm and yellow, far from the high-definition gloss of a music video. It felt illicit, like peeking through a window. The audio picked up the clinking of a spoon against the pot, and Norma humming a tune that wasn't one of George's songs, but an old hymn. It was the sound of normalcy, so rare and precious that the viewers were paralyzed, unable to look away. They weren't watching a concert. They were watching the quiet, sacred reality of a legend's home. Then the sound of gravel crunching outside drifted through the open window, tires on stone, the heavy thud of a truck door closing. Norma turned from the stove, her face softening. She looked toward the back door, unaware that 75,000 people were now looking in the same direction. The handle of the back door turned with a metallic rattle. The door swung open, and the night air rushed in, carrying the scent of dust and diesel. George Strait stepped into the frame. He didn't look like the king. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world in his saddlebags. He was wearing a faded blue plaid shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and age. His hat, a resistor that had seen better days, was pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes. He carried it in his hand now, running his other hand through his gray hair, messing it up in a way the stylists never allowed. He kicked off his boots by the door, wincing slightly as his weight shifted, a subtle reminder of old rodeo injuries that never quite healed. Norma smiled at him, a gentle, knowing smile. "You're late," she said softly. "The soup is almost ready." George didn't answer immediately. He walked to the table, the heavy oak table that dominated the foreground of the camera's view. He pulled out a chair, the wood scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made thousands of viewers flinch in sympathy. He sat down heavily right in front of the phone, though his gaze was directed at his hands, which were clasped tightly together on the placemat. The camera angle was perfect, capturing the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, the slump of his shoulders. "It's been a hell of a day, Norma," George said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the melodic charm he used on stage. It was raw, gravelly, the voice of a man who had been talking to lawyers and bankers for hours. Norma moved into the frame, placing a hand on his shoulder. She didn't see the phone. She only saw her husband. What happened? Did the meeting with the specialist go well? Or was it the other thing? George rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of profound weariness. The comments on the screen were flying so fast they were a blur. He looked so sad. "What specialist? Is he sick?" "Everybody be quiet. Listen to him. This feels wrong to watch, but I can't stop." George looked up at Norma, his blue eyes watery and red-rimmed. "It's not the specialist for me, honey. I told you I'm fine. It's Miller. Miller." The name hung in the air. The die-hard fans knew the name. Old Miller, the ranch foreman who had been with George since before Unwound hit the charts. Miller, who had taught George's son to rope. Miller, who had guarded the ranch while George was touring the world. Norma pulled a chair close and sat down, her back to the camera, blocking a portion of the view but framing George perfectly. "What did the doctors say?" George sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. "It's the cancer, Norma. It's aggressive. They can operate, but the insurance—" He shook his head, looking down at the table again. "The insurance company found a loophole. Pre-existing condition, some paperwork error from 10 years ago. They aren't going to cover the surgery. And even if they did, the rehab, the medication— Miller is looking at $500,000 just to have a fighting chance." Norma gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh, George, that poor man. And Martha. How is she taking it?" "She's terrified," George said, his voice cracking. He picked up a salt shaker and turned it over in his fingers, staring at it unseeingly. "But that's not the worst part. Miller, he's proud. You know him, stubborn as a mule. He put the deed to his little place up as collateral for a loan last week, trying to pay for the first round of chemo. The bank is calling it in. If he doesn't pay by Friday, they take the house. He's going to lose his life and his home in the same month." The chat room on the live stream froze. The frivolity of the internet vanished. 100,000 people were suddenly witnessing a tragedy unfold in real time. This wasn't celebrity gossip. This was the harsh, brutal reality of life that hit everyone, regardless of status. But the tension came from seeing George Strait, a man worth millions, looking helpless. "Why doesn't he let us help?" Norma asked, echoing the question screaming in the minds of the viewers. "You've offered." "I know you have." "I offered to write a check this morning," George said, looking directly at Norma, his eyes fierce. "I told him I'd pay for everything, every dime. You know what he said? He looked me in the eye and said, 'George, I've worked for my keep my whole life. I ain't taking charity, not even from you. If I can't pay my way, then it's my time to go.'" He walked out of the barn. He'd rather die than feel like a burden. George slammed his hand lightly on the table, the vibration shaking the phone propped against the sugar bowl. The image wobbled, refocusing on his face. He looked angry, not at Miller, but at the situation. At the cruelty of a world where a man could work for 50 years and lose it all to a sickness he didn't ask for. "So what are we going to do?" Norma asked softly. "We can't just let him lose the house." "I have a plan," George whispered. "But you can't tell him, and you can't tell the boys. The number of viewers hit 200,000. The algorithm had pushed the stream to the front page of every platform. George Strait live confession was trending worldwide. People were tuning in expecting a song and finding a soul-bearing drama. George reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing it out on the wood. It was a document, dense with legal text. "I went to the vault today," George said. I pulled the title. Norma leaned in, squinting at the paper. "George, is that the daddy's car? The Chevy?" George nodded. The 1958 Corvette his father had bought brand new. The car George had learned to drive in. The car he had restored bolt by bolt with his dad before he passed. It was the one possession George had sworn never to sell. It was a piece of his history, a mechanical member of the family. It sat in the climate-controlled garage under a tarp, visited like a shrine. "You can't," Norma whispered. "George, that car it's your heart." "It's just metal, Norma," George said, though his voice trembled. "Miller is flesh and blood. I made a call to a collector in Dallas, a private buyer. He's been hounding me for that car for 20 years. He agreed to the price, cash, wiring it to a shell account I set up." He looked at the camera without seeing it, his gaze thousand-yard stare. "I'm going to funnel the money through the bank. We're going to tell Miller it was an accounting error, that the bank found an old insurance policy he didn't know he had. He'll never know it came from me. He keeps his pride, he keeps his house, and he gets the surgery. But the car—" Norma sounded like she was crying. "You love that car." "I love Miller more," George said simply. The simplicity of the statement hit the audience like a physical blow. In a world of carefully curated public images, of billionaires building rockets while people starved, here was the king of country, quietly sacrificing his most sentimental possession to save an employee who was too proud to ask for help. and he was doing it in secret. Or so he thought. The comments section was a waterfall of tears. I can't breathe. This is what a real man looks like. We have to stop him. He shouldn't have to sell the car. How do we help? Does anyone have a link? He doesn't know we are watching. This is heartbreaking. George sat back in the chair, the adrenaline of the confession leaving him drained. He looked small in the kitchen light. I have to drive it up to Dallas tonight, Norma. The buyer wants it before dawn. He's shipping it overseas. Once it's gone, it's gone. I won't ever see it again. Tonight? Norma asked. You're exhausted. I can't sleep anyway, George replied. I'd rather get it over with. It's like pulling off a band-aid. If I wait until morning, I might lose the nerve. And Miller doesn't have until morning. The bank is coming at noon tomorrow. He stood up, the chair scraping again. I'm going to go prep the trailer. Can you make me a thermos of that coffee? I'm going to need it. Norma nodded, standing up as well. Of course, George, of course. She moved to the coffee maker, leaving the frame. George stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. He looked around the room, taking in the comfort of his home, the safety of it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. He reached for his hat on the table, and as he did, his eyes brushed past the sugar bowl. He paused. His hand hovered over his hat, his brow furrowed. He leaned in slightly, his face coming closer to the lens. The phone was black, sleek, blending in with the dark granite of the pepper grinder. But the screen was alive. George squinted. The red light pulse was small, but in the dim kitchen it was unmistakable. He saw the scrolling text, the waterfall of names and messages moving so fast they were illegible. Norma? George said, his voice changing tone. It wasn't the weary voice anymore, it was sharp, confused. Yes, dear, Norma called from the sink. Why is your phone glowing? The question hung in the air. The audience held its collective breath. 300,000 people froze. This was the moment. The intrusion was about to be discovered. The violation of privacy, accidental as it was about to confront the man who valued his privacy above all else. George reached out. His large, calloused hand filled the screen as he touched the phone. He didn't turn it off. He picked it up. The angle shifted wildly, the ceiling spinning into view, then George's face, close up, looking down at the device. He wasn't looking at the camera lens, he was looking at the screen. He was reading, "We love you, George. Don't sell the car. We are here for Miller. You are a good man. Live 325 400 viewers." George's eyes went wide. The color drained from his face under the tan. He stared at the number. 325,000. Norma! He barked, a sound of pure shock. Norma dropped a spoon. It clattered loudly on the floor. She rushed over, drying her hands frantically. What? What is it? Look at this. George turned the screen toward her. Norma looked. She adjusted her glasses. She squinted. Then she gasped, a sound that was half scream, half sob. Oh my God. Oh my sweet Lord. Is that... Are we... We're live, George said, his voice hollow. We've been live. For how long? Norma whispered, terrified. George looked at the timer in the corner. 17 minutes. Silence descended on the kitchen. 17 minutes. They had heard everything. The bank, the cancer, the secret plan, the car, the deception to save Miller's pride. George looked at the camera. He looked directly into the eyes of 300,000 strangers. He didn't look angry. He looked exposed, naked. The armor of the superstar had been stripped away, leaving only the man who was trying to do a good deed in the dark. He raised his hand to end the stream. His finger hovered over the End Live button. Wait, Norma said, grabbing his wrist. George, wait. Look, she pointed at the comments. They weren't just text anymore, they were moving differently. Flashing colors, super chats, donations. Donation $100, keep the car. Donation $50 for Miller. Donation $1,000 from the Smith family in Ohio. We love you. Donation $5. It's all I have, but please help him. The stream of money was moving faster than the comments. The numbers were blurring. George stared. He didn't understand. He was from a generation of vinyl records and radio waves. This digital tsunami of instant generosity was alien to him. "What is happening?" he whispered. Norma was reading the messages, tears streaming down her face. They're paying it, George. They're paying for Miller." George shook his head. No, I can't take their money. This isn't a charity telethon. Turn it off, Norma." He went to press the button again, but a notification banner dropped down from the top of the screen, blocking the button. It was a text message from his manager. George hesitated. The conflict in his eyes was visible to the world. His pride, his desire for privacy, warring with the overwhelming wave of love coming through the device. He lowered the phone slowly, setting it back against the sugar bowl, but this time he didn't look away. He sat down. He took off his hat. He looked at the lens. "I don't know who is out there," George began, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know how much you heard, but this is a private family matter." "We are your family too, George," a comment floated up. George read it. A sad smile touched his lips. He looked at Norma. She was crying openly now, watching the donation counter that someone had pinned in the chat. "George," she said, her voice trembling, "look at the number." George leaned in. He squinted at the small font. $450,000. In 17 minutes. The air left the room. The car, the 1958 Corvette, was still in the garage. The secret was out, but the burden was shifting. The weight that had been crushing George Strait's chest in the parking lot of the Broken Spoke was suddenly being lifted by 300,000 pairs of hands. But George Strait was a man of honor, and charity was a hard pill to swallow for a cowboy, even when it wasn't for him. "I can't keep this," he said to the camera, his tone firm. "You folks, you have good hearts, but I can pay my own debts. I can take care of my own people." "It's not for you, George," the comments screamed back. "It's for Miller." George paused. He looked at the screen, really looked at it. He saw the names: soldiers, teachers, nurses, truck drivers, people who probably had mortgages of their own, people who listened to his music when they were heartbroken, when they were celebrating, when they were driving home alone in the dark. Then a sound cut through the kitchen, a phone ringing, not Norma's cell, the landline on the wall, the old-fashioned phone that only a few people had the number for. George turned his head. He looked at the wall phone, then he looked at Norma. "It's probably the manager," Norma said. "Or the bank," George muttered. He stood up and walked to the wall phone. The camera followed him in the background. He picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The kitchen was silent enough that the microphone on the smartphone picked up the voice on the other end of the line. It was loud, frantic. "George? Is that you?" "It's Miller." George froze. His back went rigid. He turned slowly to face the smartphone, his eyes wide with panic. Miller was watching. "Miller," George said, his voice tight. "I can explain." "Explain?" Miller's voice cracked over the line, audible to the world. "George, my granddaughter ran in here with her iPad. She said you were selling the Corvette. For me?" George closed his eyes. The secret was dead. The dignity he had tried so hard to preserve for his friend was hanging by a thread. "So I was just doing what needed doing, Miller," George said softly. "You stubborn old fool." Miller sounded like he was weeping. "You were going to sell your daddy's car?" "It's just metal, Miller. You're my brother." "Well, you ain't selling it," Miller said, his voice gaining strength. "Because I'm looking at this screen, George, and I don't think you need to sell anything. I think the whole damn world just decided to pay the bill." George looked back at the smartphone. The donation counter had just ticked past $600,000. The receiver of the landline phone felt heavy in George's hand, a relic of a time when communication was tethered to the wall, not floating in the ether for millions to grab. He pressed the plastic against his ear, closing his eyes as if that could shut out the digital storm raging on the small screen a few feet away. On the other end of the line, the silence was thick, broken only by the wet, ragged breathing of a man who was trying desperately not to sob. Miller was a man who had broken wild horses, mended fences in freezing rain, and dug post holes until his hands bled. Hearing him cry was like hearing a mountain crack. It was a sound that didn't belong in nature. George gripped the phone cord, wrapping it around his finger. a nervous habit from his youth that he hadn't realized he still possessed. He turned his back to the kitchen table, to Norma, and to the glowing eye of the smartphone, trying to carve out a private corner in a room that had become the world's stage. "Miller," George said, his voice low and steady, trying to lend his own strength to the man on the other end. "Listen to me. You turn off that iPad. You stop looking at the screen. This is between you and me. It always has been." "I can't, George," Miller choked out, his voice tinny through the receiver but amplified by the silence of the kitchen, so that the microphone on the table picked up every syllable. "My granddaughter, she's reading the messages to me. She says they're from everywhere, Germany, Brazil, Australia. She says people are praying for me in languages I don't even speak." George looked out the window into the darkness of the ranch. He saw his reflection in the glass, a ghost superimposed over the Texas night. "It's a lot of noise, Miller. Just noise. We'll sort it out in the morning. I'm coming over there first thing." "You were going to sell the Veta," Miller said, the awe in his voice cutting through his pain. "George, I remember the day you brought that car home after your daddy passed. I remember you sitting in the driver's seat for 3 hours without turning the key, just running your hands over the steering wheel because it still smelled like his cologne. You told me that car was the only place you could still talk to him." George's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "That car is just a machine, Miller. It's fiberglass and steel. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't have a family. You do." "It ain't just a machine," Miller argued, his voice gaining a sudden, fierce energy. "It's your history, and you were going to trade your history for my future. I don't know what to say to that. A man doesn't do that unless—" Miller's voice broke again, dissolving into a jagged weep that tore at George's heart. Norma was standing by the table, tears streaming freely down her face. She wasn't wiping them away anymore. She was watching the comments on the screen, her hand covering her mouth in astonishment. She looked up at George, her eyes wide, and whispered loudly enough for the stream to hear. "George, Dolly is in the chat." George pulled the phone away from his ear for a second, frowning. "What?" "Dolly," Norma repeated, pointing at the screen. "Dolly Parton. And Alan. And, oh my heavens, is that the governor?" George stared at her. The surreal nature of the moment was becoming suffocating. He put the phone back to his ear. "Miller, I have to go. Things are getting complicated here. You just rest. Do you hear me? You rest. The bank isn't taking anything. Not while I have breath in my lungs." "George," Miller said, his voice quiet now, filled with a profound peace. "I love you, brother." "I love you too, you stubborn old goat," George whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. He hung up the phone. The click of the receiver into the cradle sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. George stood there for a moment, his hand still resting on the phone, his head bowed. He took a deep breath, composing himself, putting the mask back on. But as he turned around, he realized the mask was useless. The 350,000 people watching didn't want the king of country. They wanted this man, the man who loved his friend enough to bleed for him. He walked back to the table. He didn't sit down. He felt too restless, too exposed. He looked at the phone propped against the sugar bowl. The red, live light was still pulsing, a heartbeat that connected him to the world. "Norma," he said gently, "bring the phone." Norma looked at him surprised. "You want me to turn it off?" "No," George said. He reached out and took his hat from the table, placing it on his head and adjusting the brim with a practiced motion. "If they're going to be part of this, if they're going to help Miller, they deserve to see what was at stake. They deserve to know it wasn't a bluff." He gestured for her to follow him. "Come on." Norma picked up the phone with trembling hands. The camera angle shifted wildly again, showing the floor, the ceiling, and then stabilizing as she turned it to face George. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breathless. "To the garage," George said, opening the back door. The night air was thick and humid, filled with the chorus of crickets. The camera adjusted to the darkness, the light from the porch casting long shadows as George walked across the gravel driveway. The sound of his boots crunching on the stones was rhythmic, steady. He didn't look back at the camera. He walked with a purpose. The comments were flying by so fast they were unreadable, a blur of neon text. "Where is he going?" "Follow him. This is history. I've never seen him like this. Look at how he walks. That's a man on a mission. They reached a detached building, a large structure made of the same limestone as the house. George pulled a set of keys from his pocket. The jingle of metal was sharp and clear. He unlocked the side door and flipped a switch. Banks of fluorescent lights flickered and hummed to life, illuminating a space that was more museum than garage. The floor was polished concrete, spotless. Posters of old rodeos and framed gold records lined the walls. But in the center of the room, under a custom-fitted black cover, sat a shape that was unmistakably a car. George walked over to it. He stopped a few feet away, his hands on his hips. Norma stood back, framing him and the covered car in the shot. The silence in the garage was reverent. "This," George said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. He reached out and grabbed the corner of the cover. With a smooth motion, he pulled the cover back. The light caught the chrome first, blindingly bright, then the paint. Snowcrest white with silver coves, a 1958 Chevrolet Corvette convertible. It was flawless. It looked not like a car that had been driven, but like a jewel that had been preserved in amber. The red interior leather was rich and deep. It was a masterpiece of American engineering, a time capsule from an era when cars were built with soul. George folded the cover and placed it on a workbench. He walked around the car, running his hand along the rear fender. He touched the metal with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "My dad bought this car the week I turned 6, George said, speaking to the air, speaking to the millions. He wasn't a rich man then. He was a schoolteacher who worked a ranch on the weekends. He saved for 5 years for this. He used to sit me on his lap and let me steer while we drove down the farm roads. He told me that life was like steering a car like this. You have to look far down the road, not just at the hood, or you'll end up in the ditch." He opened the driver's side door. The latch clicked with a solid mechanical sound. He leaned in, the smell of old leather and gasoline wafting out, a scent that triggered memories so potent George had to close his eyes for a second. "When he got sick," George continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, "when the cancer took him, this was the last place he wanted to be. We sat in this garage, in this car, listening to the radio. He told me, 'Son, things are just things. They break, they rust, they fade. But the people you love, that's the only thing that lasts.'" George looked up, staring directly into the lens of the smartphone held by Norma. "I forgot that for a while," he admitted. "I held onto this car like it was him. I polished it, I tuned it, I kept it safe. I thought if I kept the car perfect, I could keep a piece of him alive." He rested his hand on the steering wheel. "But tonight, when I looked at Miller, when I saw the fear in his eyes, I heard my dad's voice. He was telling me that he didn't buy this car to sit in a museum. He bought it to be driven, and he didn't raise me to value chrome over character." George took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling visibly. "I was ready to let it go," he said firmly. "I had the bill of sale in my pocket, and I want you to know I would do it again, in a heartbeat, because Miller is the one who taught me how to rope. He's the one who pulled me out of the mud when I got thrown. He's the one who sat with me when my daughter died. You can't put a price on that. You can't insure that." Norma sniffled behind the camera. The image shook as she wiped her eyes with her free hand. "George," she whispered, "look at the screen." George stepped away from the car. He walked over to Norma and looked at the phone. The donation counter had stopped moving, not because the donations had stopped, but because the software had maxed out the display. It was stuck at 999,999.99 plahars, but it was the comments that caught his eye. "The car stays. Don't you dare sell that car, King. We got Miller. You keep the memory. This is for your dad too." And then a video request popped up. It was from a verified account, a news station in Dallas, but beneath that, a message from the bank that held Miller's mortgage. The official account of the bank had posted in the chat, pinned by the moderators who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere to manage the chaos. "First Texas Community Bank. Mr. Straight, we are watching. We had no idea about the circumstances regarding Mr. Miller's health. We are pausing all foreclosure proceedings immediately. Please check your DMs. We want to make this right." George read the message. He let out a laugh, a dry, incredulous sound. "Now they want to make it right," he said, a flash of the old cowboy anger flaring in his eyes. "Now that 3 million people are watching. Now that the world is shining a spotlight on their paperwork." He looked at the camera, his expression hardening. "I appreciate that. he said to the bank, his voice steel. "I truly do, but it shouldn't take a George Strait live stream for a man to be treated with dignity. It shouldn't take a viral moment for a bank to realize that a 30-year customer deserves more than a form letter and the eviction notice." "Preach!" the comments exploded. "Tell them, George." George shook his head. He looked back at the Corvette. He looked at his hands. "Norma," he said, "how much is in there? In the fund?" Norma tapped the screen to refresh the back end. Her eyes went wide. "George, it's over $2 million. $2 million, George repeated. He looked stunned. That's 4 times what Miller needs." He paced the garage floor, the energy of the moment making it impossible to stand still. This had started as a mistake, a technological fumble by his wife in the kitchen. It had turned into a confession, then a movement. Now, it was a responsibility. "We can't keep that money," George said. "Miller needs his share. He needs his house paid off, his medical bills covered for the rest of his life. But the rest..." He looked at the car again. An idea began to form. A way to turn this chaotic invasion of privacy into something that would last longer than the viral cycle. "Norma, turn the camera around. I want to talk to them face to face." Norma fumbled for a moment, tapping the screen until the view flipped. Now the audience saw Norma's face for a split second, tear-streaked, smiling nervously, before she turned the phone back to George. He leaned against the fender of the 1958 Corvette. He crossed his arms. He looked like the icon he was, but stripped of the glamour. He was just a Texan in a garage. "All right, folks," George said. "You've done something incredible tonight. You've saved a good man. You've saved his home. And you've taught an old cowboy a lesson about the power of whatever this is." He gestured to the phone. "But there are a lot of Millers out there," he continued. "There are a lot of cowboys and cowgirls, farmers and ranchers who are too proud to ask for help and are drowning in bills they didn't ask for. They don't have a George Strait to sell a Corvette for them." He paused, looking down at his boots, then back up, his eyes locking with the lens. "So here's what we're going to do. Miller gets what he needs, every penny. But every dollar over that? We're starting a fund. Tonight, right now, the Miller Fund. For the folks in the rural communities who are falling through the cracks, for the people who feed this country but can't afford to feed themselves when sickness hits." He patted the white fender of the Corvette. "And this car?" he asked. The chat held its breath. "I'm not selling it to a collector," George said. "I'm not locking it away." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys. "Miller has always loved this car. He's the one who washes it. He's the one who changes the oil. He treats it better than I do." George smiled, a genuine crooked smile that lit up his face for the first time that night. "When Miller gets out of that hospital, when he beats this thing, I'm tossing him these keys. This car belongs to the man who embodies what my daddy stood for. It belongs to the man who was willing to lose everything to keep his dignity." He looked at the keys in his hand, then at the camera. "You folks bought this car tonight. You bought it with your $5 and your $10. You bought it back for me. So I'm giving it to him." The emotional release in the chat was instantaneous. It was a digital roar of approval. But just as George was about to say goodnight, just as he was about to instruct Norma to finally find the button to end the broadcast, a sound came from the driveway outside. Not the sound of a truck, the sound of sirens, and the heavy thrum of a helicopter rotor beating the air above the ranch. George's head snapped up. He looked toward the open garage door. Blue and red lights were flashing against the trees at the end of the long driveway. "Norma," George said, his voice dropping to a protective growl. "What is that?" Norma moved to the door, the camera shaking as she walked. She pointed the phone out into the night. The road leading to the ranch, usually empty for miles, was a snake of headlights. News vans, police escorts, fans who had figured out the location based on the kitchen layout. The world had arrived at their doorstep. George walked up behind her. He looked at the chaos encroaching on his sanctuary. He had invited the world in digitally, and now the physical world had come to collect. "They're here," George said. He put a hand on Norma's shoulder. "Don't turn it off yet," he said. "Why?" Norma asked, panic rising in her voice. "George, they're swarming the gate." "Because," George said, putting his hat back on firmly, "if they want a show, we're going to give them one, but it's going to be on our terms. and I have one more thing to say to that bank before we sign off." He walked out of the garage into the flashing lights, straight toward the gate where the cameras were waiting, with Norma following close behind, streaming every step of the long walk down the driveway. The gravel of the long driveway crunched rhythmically under George Strait's boots, a sound that usually signified solitude, but tonight was the drumbeat of a march toward chaos. Norma walked a step behind him, the smartphone held high, her arms aching from the weight and the tension. On the screen, the viewer count had stabilized at a staggering 4 million. The entire world, it seemed, was walking down this Texas dirt road with them. The night sky, usually a canvas of deep indigo and stars, was now polluted by the strobe light effect of red and blue emergency bars and the blinding white glare of television news floodlights waiting at the iron gates. George didn't shield his eyes. He walked with the same steady rolling gait that had carried him across stages from the Astrodome to Vegas. He was a man who had spent a lifetime protecting his privacy, building fences both literal and metaphorical to keep the madness of fame at bay. But tonight he was walking deliberately into the fire. He stopped 10 feet from the heavy wrought iron gates. Through the metal bars, the scene was a frenzy. Microphones were being thrust through the gaps. Reporters were shouting questions over one another. "George, is it true about the car? Mr. Strait, what do you say to the bank? George, look over here." He raised a hand. It was a simple gesture, not a wave, but a command. The shouting didn't stop immediately, but it faltered. The authority of the king of country was not something to be ignored, even by a hungry press pack. He turned his back to the gate, facing Norma and the smartphone. He was ignoring the major networks to speak directly to the people holding the device in their kitchens, their living rooms, and their truck cabs. "Norma," he said, his voice cutting through the background noise. "Get close, I want them to hear this." Norma stepped in, the camera framing George's face against the backdrop of the flashing paparazzi lights. He looked like a warrior in the aftermath of a battle, tired but unbowed. "I'm not going to answer questions from the folks behind me," George said to the camera, his eyes locking with the lens. "They are here for the spectacle. You folks, you are here for the heart." He took a breath, inhaling the dust and the diesel fumes. "Tonight started as an accident. My wife, God bless her, pressed the wrong button. You saw into my kitchen. You saw my worry. You saw a man who was ready to sell his past to save a friend's future. And I'm not ashamed of that." He pointed a thumb over his shoulder at the mass of media vans. "These folks want to know if I'm angry at the bank, if I'm going to sue, if I'm going to write a song about it." He shook his head. "I don't have time for anger. Anger doesn't pay chemotherapy bills. Anger doesn't keep a roof over a family's head. What you did tonight, that wasn't anger. That was love. That was 4 million strangers deciding that a ranch foreman named Miller mattered." George leaned in closer. "To the CEO of First Texas Community Bank, who I know is watching because your PR team has been blowing up my manager's phone for the last 20 minutes. I saw your message. You want to make it right. You want to pause the foreclosure." George's eyes narrowed slightly, the blue turning icy. "You're pausing it because you got caught. You're pausing it because the light got turned on. But I'm telling you now, and I'm telling every bank that operates in these rural towns, we are watching. These people in the chat, they are watching. You treat the Millers of this world with respect, or you will answer to them, and you will answer to me." The chat went nuclear. Emojis of cowboy hats and fire filled the screen. "And to you," George said, his voice softening as he addressed the fans. "Go home, turn off the stream, go hug your kids, call your parents. Forgive a grudge. You did good tonight. You did real good. But the show is over. The real work, the healing, the recovery, that happens in the quiet. And I need some quiet now." He looked at Norma. "Cut it, honey." Norma's finger trembled as she reached for the screen. She tapped the end video button. The red light in the corner vanished. The screen went black. The connection was severed. The silence that followed was instant and jarring. The digital roar was gone, leaving only the physical noise of the reporters at the gate. George slumped slightly, the adrenaline leaving his body. He turned to the security team that had finally arrived, flanking the gate. "Clear the driveway," George ordered the head of security. "Tell the press if they set 1 foot on the property, I'm pressing charges for trespassing. I want this road empty in 10 minutes. He didn't wait for a response. He took Norma's arm, guiding her back toward the house. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sound the crunch of their boots and the distant chop of the news helicopter turning away. When they reached the porch, the safety of the shadows wrapping around them, Norma stopped. She looked at the phone in her hand as if it were a grenade that had just exploded. "I'm so sorry, George," she whispered, the tears returning. "I didn't know. I just wanted to record the soup recipe." George stopped. He took the phone from her hand and slipped it into his pocket. Then he pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair. "Don't be sorry," he murmured. "Norma, you just saved Miller's life. I was going to sell the car, and it would have paid the bills, yes. But this showed him he wasn't alone. That's medicine money can't buy." He pulled back and kissed her forehead. "But maybe next time. Let's stick to writing letters." 3 days later, the sterile smell of antiseptic and floor wax filled the hallway of the San Antonio Methodist Hospital. It was a sharp contrast to the smell of hay and leather that George was used to. He walked down the corridor, holding a Stetson in his hands, his boots clicking softly on the linoleum. He wore a clean, pressed shirt, but he felt out of place, as he always did in hospitals. Hospitals were places where control was stripped away, where nature took its course regardless of a man's will. He stopped at room 402. Through the glass window, he saw Miller. The old foreman looked small in the hospital bed, hooked up to IV lines that were dripping the potent poisonous cure into his veins. His skin was pale, papery, but his eyes, when they turned to the door, were bright. George pushed the door open. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Miller rasped, his voice weak but spirited. "I thought you were busy being an internet sensation. My granddaughter says you're trending on TikTok. I don't even know what a TikTok is." George chuckled, pulling a plastic chair up to the bedside. "Neither do I, Miller." "Neither do I." They sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable silence of men who had ridden thousands of miles together. "The bank called me," Miller said, looking at the ceiling. "The branch manager. Personally, said the mortgage is paid in full, said there was an anonymous donor who covered the rest, and the surplus from the online thing is in a trust for the medical bills." George nodded, examining the brim of his hat. "That sounds about right." Miller turned his head, looking sharply at George. "You didn't sell it, did you?" "The car?" "No," George said. "I didn't sell it." Miller let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing. "Thank God. I was laying here sick as a dog, but all I could think about was some rich lawyer in Dallas driving your daddy's Corvette and grinding the gears. It made my blood pressure spike." George smiled. He reached into his pocket. He felt the cold metal of the keys. He pulled them out. The keychain was a small silver stirrup, worn smooth by time. "I didn't sell it," George repeated, "because I gave it away." Miller frowned. "You what?" George reached over and placed the keys on the bedside table, right next to the plastic cup of water and the call button. The metal clinked loudly. Miller stared at the keys. He looked at George. He looked back at the keys. "George," Miller whispered, "stop fooling around." "I ain't fooling," George said, his voice serious. "I told 3 million people that car belongs to the man who embodies what my father stood for. That's you, Miller. You're the one who taught me that a man is only as good as his word. You're the one who stayed when things got lean in the 90s, but it's a Corvette, George. It's a classic. And you're a classic," George countered. "Look, the doctor says this chemo is going to be hell. He says you're going to want to quit. You're going to be tired. You're going to hurt." George leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So here's the deal. That car is sitting in my garage right now, but it's yours. And the only way you get to drive it, and the only way you get to hear that engine purr, is if you walk out of this hospital. You have to finish the treatment. You have to do the rehab. You have to get strong enough to push that clutch pedal." Miller's eyes filled with tears. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the keys. He didn't pick them up. He just rested his fingers on the silver stirrup. "You're bribing me to live, George. I'm giving you a goal, Miller. I'm giving you a horizon to ride toward." Miller closed his hand around the keys. He squeezed them tight, his knuckles turning white. "I'll drive it," he whispered. "I swear to you, George, I'll drive the wheels off that thing." "I know you will," George said, standing up and patting Miller's leg. "I know you will." 6 months later, the Texas heat had broken. giving way to the crisp golden light of early autumn. The leaves on the pecan trees were turning amber, and the air smelled of dry grass and cooling earth. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that was made for driving. The gate of the Straight Ranch swung open. George sat in his truck idling by the mailbox. He had the window down, his arm resting on the doorframe. He was watching the rearview mirror. A low rumble began to build from the direction of the main house. It wasn't the clatter of a diesel truck or the whine of a tractor. It was a deep, throaty burble, the sound of American muscle, the sound of a V8 engine breathing freely. Around the bend of the driveway, the white 1958 Corvette appeared. It gleamed in the sunlight, the chrome catching the rays and scattering them like diamonds. The top was down. Behind the wheel sat Miller. He was thinner than he used to be. His hair was gone, replaced by a simple baseball cap, but his color was back. His hands, gripping the large, thin steering wheel, were steady. He wore sunglasses and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. He pulled the Corvette up alongside George's truck. The engines idled together, a mechanical harmony. Miller revved the engine once, a playful growl. "You keeping up, old man?" Miller shouted over the noise. George laughed, a genuine belly-deep laugh that felt like freedom. "I'll try, Miller, but don't you scratch my paint. It's my paint now," Miller yelled back. Miller dropped the car into gear. The tires chirped against the asphalt as he accelerated, the white car shooting forward down the empty country road, leaving a swirl of dust in its wake. George watched him go. He watched the taillights fade into the distance. He thought about the accidental live stream. He thought about the millions of dollars in the fund that was now helping ranch hands across 5 states pay for insulin and surgeries. He thought about the invasion of privacy that had felt like a disaster but had turned into a miracle. He put his truck in drive and eased out onto the road, following his friend. He wasn't the king of country today. He wasn't a celebrity. He was just a man following a white Corvette into the sunset, grateful that the road went on a little longer. The music on the radio was low, but the song in his heart was loud. It was a song about redemption, about the accidental grace of the universe, and about the simple, undeniable fact that sometimes the things we try hardest to hide are the things the world needs to see the most. George Strait drove on, the Texas sky wide and open above him, covering the good, the bad, and the beautiful struggle of it all.